Join me in welcoming Professor Nigel Vincent.
Thank you very much for inviting me. It's a great pleasure and an honour to be here. As you can see from the screen, although I was at the University of Manchester, I'm now retired, but the work that I'm going to talk about today is work that I've done in my role as the Director for Language Policy at the British Academy, which is the British Academy is a national institution, one of whose tasks is to address issues that relate to universities, university teaching, subjects that are done in universities, and the way they relate to national issues. And specifically what I'm going to talk about is things that we discovered in some of our reports which turn out to have striking parallels with the United States. And so I'll be trying to draw throughout some parallels with the United States, but I have to emphasize right from the beginning, I'm not an expert on the United States situation. So if I get things wrong, about the UK, that's my fault, and you can jump on me. But if I get things wrong about the US, then you just tell me in any questions or discussion afterwards. But the kind of basic issue is well encapsulated in, well, this is an outline of what I'll try and cover first. So I'll cover some parallels, I say, between the US and the UK. I'll talk about the initiatives that have come out of our work at the British Academy, and then I'll look at some specific areas. So I'll look at issues about language in relation to national security, UK and US, language in relation to business and trade, language in relation to big cities, and I'll talk about the linguistic composition of large cities, of which New York is quite a good example, and issues about language in the media, and then not forgetting a fundamental one, language and culture, before I conclude. And this quotation seems to me to say it all. This is from a well-known advocate of language education in Australia, and commenting on the way the world is, he says there are two disadvantages in global language arrangements. One of them, you're in trouble if you don't know English, because it has such a large presence. The second one is you're in trouble if you only know English. And it's exactly that balance and that problem we have in the UK, and to some extent there's evidence in the US as well, that people over-rely on the rest of the world knowing English. And that has disadvantages which we will try and talk about. So this is an American report that was published in June 2014 from the Center for Advanced Study of Language at the University of Maryland, and particularly under the direction of a professor, director there called Richard Brecht. And this is what they say in that report. The desired state would be for the US, and I'll argue also for the UK, that within the next decade there should be nationwide acceptance of the teaching of a second language to a growing population at all levels of the education system, starting early with K-12, with universal and equal access to language learning opportunities throughout the United States. And then they make more specific what that would mean: an appreciation of the role of language and culture in contemporary domestic and international societies. In other words, not a kind of flattening out of the globe by dealing with it only through the way it appears to the world in English. Usable skills amongst the population for domestic interaction and international travel. High-level skills for global professional practice, and that's one of the things I'll emphasize, the way in which increasingly there's competition between native speakers of English, as in the US or the UK, and in effect, native speakers of many other countries of the world who've learned English to such a level that they're functionally bilingual, even if their accents aren't always exactly what we would recognize as native. And expertise, therefore, that the nation needs to have in providing language education and language technology. So these are all from that report. And these are the parallels then that emerge from reading that report in the context of the situation in the UK. One is a very high level of linguistic complacency, that we don't need to worry too much because the rest of the world will speak English. So my brother, for example, who is a retired civil engineer who's built bridges and roads all over the world, thinks it's fine. You just speak English and everybody speaks English back to you, and you just get on with building the bridges. Except that his bridges are solely concrete. They don't have cultural dimensions. a decline of the status of language in education. That's particularly grave in the United Kingdom. I don't know whether it's the same in this country, but in the United Kingdom there is a real matter of concern about the role of languages and the closure of language departments in universities. At the same time, because both the United Kingdom and the United States are countries with significant international presence in various ways, members of G7 and so on, you would expect that there should be language skills that go with that. And there are, as I'll try and show, language needs in business, security and diplomacy. And this is an interesting thing, there are actually within both your country and mine, large multilingual indigenous communities who don't necessarily get the linguistic respect that they deserve. And another more, how shall I put it, instrumentalist way of thinking about it would be, actually that's a very valuable national resource that isn't being cultivated significantly. So this is the work that I'll talk about in the British Academy. What we've done is a series of reports, and if you're interested in following up any of these things, you can simply Google the British Academy, you'll get to a website, and you can then go to the publications page, and all of these reports that are just sketched briefly are downloadable and can be followed through. So we have one which is called State of the Nation that I won't talk about here, which is essentially an attempt to survey the language needs of the nation, and very much parallels what was in the American Languages for All report. A new project that's due to come to fruition this summer, called Born Global, which is investigating in more detail what is the need for languages in relation to business and industry. A project called Lost for Words, which reported year before last at the end of 2013, about the role of languages in the international security and diplomacy contexts. And something called The Art of Attraction, which is a report about the concept of soft power, and I'll explain a little bit what that means in a minute. So we've been doing a series of reports. Here's our brief sketch of what's in each of those. Just perhaps need to keep an eye on the time. How long should I, when should I finish? When I absolutely will be shot if I haven't finished.
Let's see.
Before 5, you asked me. Yes. Okay, right. Okay, well then I'll make sure I keep on that track. So the first one was then the report Born Global, and that's the project that's aiming to understand the language needs in the context of industry, and to investigate the use of language in the workplace, and to investigate attitudes of employers and employees to language skills. And the slides that are coming up are ones that are results that are in the course of being developed. None of this has yet been published, so that this will be a report that will be published towards the end of this year, probably in September or October. But so these, what you've got here on the side is the questions that were asked of a series of people who work in business, and it's, it won't be, can you read that right at the back? How good's your eyesight? Not great. Okay, well I'll make sure I... So the questions on the side, you're asking people, how strongly do you agree with a set of statements? And so the, what I can do with here is my, has anybody got a pointer?
Does anyone have a laser pointer?
Got one in my bag, but should have brought it out. Anyway, so what you've got here is this question says, do you agree that foreign languages skills are equally important as science and technology skills, what we in the jargon call STEM skills? And nearly 50% of the people in business who've been asked say yes to that. That people who only speak English are at a disadvantage. 1/3 of the people who respond think that people who only have English are at a disadvantage. Nearly 2/3 would agree that if you're bilingual, as a young person, you're going to have a better chance of employability. And bilingual here really doesn't mean bilingual in the strict literal sense of somebody who was speaking, say, English and French since the, oh wow, thank you very much.
That's old school.
English and French since birth, but able to command two languages and use them in a professional context. So what some people call functional bilingualism rather than strict position or by the rule. There are different kinds of sources, and one of the things that we'll look at, so this question says, in relation to your organization, how do you deal with language? And one possible thing is you say you actually try and recruit people who have language skills. And so in this first question, and the grey bit here means yes, so this is saying that of those organizations that we investigated, nearly 60% said they actively want to have people with language skills. And the problem we find in the United Kingdom is that it's difficult to recruit those people unless what you do is to recruit people who come from outside the country. And increasingly what you discover is that, for example, if you want a bilingual, in the relevant sense, person in your business who say English and German, the chances are you'll hire a German. You won't hire an English person who knows German well, you'll hire a German person who knows English well. And so that has consequences for the employability within the market of the born Brits. Alternatively, what you do is you outsource the problem and you hire in interpreters and translations to do the business. Some invest in language training for staff. Other people prefer to hire, but they don't think of it as essential. And what we've also discovered is that some of the businesses, their solution is to say, oh, we won't do business in Germany, or we won't do business in France, because it's just too much of a hassle to speak these other things. And so the business voluntarily contracts rather than engage with the problem of finding the people who speak the language. So what we've been doing, and I won't go through all the slides because of time, but we've been asking a series of questions to try and get some sense of what is the reaction within business. This one is about which languages do you need, and there are various answers. It's hard to see because the colours haven't quite come up the way they would expect. If it's this colour, which is red on my screen, that means we never use it. So this is Arabic. This one here, where there is a lot of use, is French. This one is German, because obviously there's much more business just across the English Channel. But Spanish here is growing, and what we're going to see is that as some of these other languages, which aren't much used currently, will expand as business needs expand. And then the question about how do you use languages in your role, and then some people say internally in the business only, some people say only when we go abroad to do business. Other people, interestingly, 2/3 of the people say they use languages both inside the company and outside the company, and 1/3 not at all. So all of those figures show you in different kinds of ways a significant need within business for language that currently isn't being fulfilled. And then this is a question about how much would you advantage yourself if you had language skills, and again the recommendations are in the positive direction. And that sort of says the same thing in a slightly different graphic form. And so if somebody came to you, this is an interesting one, because this says if you asked how would you advise that they get the languages, then GCSE means the system we have in Britain, the exams you have up at the age of 16. A-levels is specialization in the last 2 years of high school, foreign language degree. And this is the interesting one, because foreign language degrees, but only if they combine with something else. So pure language degrees are under threat because employers seem not to value them to the same extent. And that's an issue that we're trying to address. And again, I'd be interested to know whether that's a similar problem in this country. Here's the next report. So that was language and business. Now language and security and diplomacy. This was a report that was published, as I say, at the end of 2013. What that demonstrated was an embarrassing lack of language skills amongst the people who were sent abroad to represent the country and or to speak the language. So 1,900, in principle, British diplomats are able to claim extra salary if they have a certain standard. And I said to my wife is Danish, and I said to her, what do you guess the figure is in the UK? How many of those 1,900? And she said, well, if it was Denmark, it would be close to 100%. But Britain's not so good at languages, so I'd guess 50%. Well, the answer is 5% of yeah, how embarrassing is that? How does it deal with it? They do the other problem that we've talked about in business. You outsource the problem. You hire in local staff to do the kind of day-to-day chat. Meanwhile, in the back room, the conversation at high level is conducted in English. So consequently, the recommendation in that report was the need for there to be a cross-governmental, that word should be strategy, for language capacity that identifies language capabilities and requirements of government and supports the development of these skills. And these are issues that particularly arise in the context of educational systems which are fragmented in the way traditionally the American one would be, because each university is independent and each university can come to its own independent decisions, whereas in some countries, Italy for example, Germany, Scandinavia, there's much more centralized control over the nature of the curriculum, and it's possible then to have a unified national policy. And so one of the issues that we have is the lack of a way to have a unified national policy, even if we can recognize the problem. Here's a specific example. We all know about the trouble that has arisen in Ukraine in recent months. There was the House of Lords had a report back in February last month, and Sir Tony Brenton, who was a leading British diplomat, said that in general he thought British diplomacy was pretty good, inverted commas, that's a good English understatement, but that it suffered because of a loss of language skills, particularly in the Foreign Office. And that had a consequence that when it came to that moment when, for example, the Crimea was annexed by the Russians, the Foreign Office didn't know, it didn't have the people who had the local knowledge and understanding to advise properly. Here's a similar thing, another place where there's been a great deal of international conflict in recent years and decades, Afghanistan, and from a book by a man who was an officer in the British Army, and one of the unusual officers who'd been trained to speak Pashto, which is the relevant language in that part of the world. Commenting on that, he says both British and American militaries do have trained linguists, but not very many of them, and crucially only in specialist, inverted commas, understanding roles, but not again at the level of decision makers. So the people who are taking the decisions are people who have to rely on other people's knowledge and understanding rather than them having directly itself. And he comments on this and introduces an interesting remark. He quotes the famous Orientalist Edward Said, most of whose academic career was spent in this country, and who commented on the way in which the discipline of Oriental studies was moving away from being a philological discipline to be a social science, and this interesting kind of tension between philology, which here really means knowing in detail how the language works and understanding the mechanisms of it and fitting it into its culture, rather than simply treating it in more general terms. So that's an interesting quote, because that quote comes from a book, a seminal book, well known in the world, that was written some 35 years ago, and the author is now deceased. But it's interesting that he would choose to quote that in a book about the issue that arose in the context of the conflict in Afghanistan. Here's something that then follows on from that. That was called Lost for Words. This is something that I wrote together with a colleague of mine, which is published in in the review of the British Academy, which is designed to deal with something else, which is the way people talk about certain aspects of language. It's to do with issues to do with code breaking and the Second World War situation. And how many people here have seen the film The Imitation Game? Okay, right, so this is my little bit of cinematic criticism. I'm not going to tell you why this isn't a good film. And I'm glad it didn't win any Oscars. And it's from this article I wrote together with my colleague Helen Wallace, who's a specialist in European politics, and is Dame Helen Wallace, Dame in English being the female equivalent of Sir, so, and a very distinguished scholar. Here's the situation. So we've got Bletchley Park, which, if you've seen the film, that's the place where all the work is done. That was the sort of code centre in the United Kingdom during the Second World War. Enigma was the name of the code, and it came off this machine pictured here, which was an Enigma machine, which was a very clever way of changing the code from message to message and making it very hard to crack. Ultra is the name of the information that came out of cracking those codes. So Bletchley Park was the center. The machine was called the Enigma machine, and the information was Ultra. And it's generally believed that the benefit of having this thing was to shorten the conflict by 2 years. That seems to be a sort of general agreement amongst scholars who studied that. Okay, so that, if we then ask ourselves, well, okay, what's the story in the imitation game? The story in the imitation game is about these 5 mathematical geniuses who are in this picture, which doesn't come out terribly well, but there's Benedict Cumberbatch there, and Keira Knightley there, and then 3 others, I forget their names. And Benedict Cumberbatch is Alan Turing. Alan Turing is the genius. I'm the University of Manchester. The University of Manchester was where Alan Turing worked after the war. What's our mass building called? It's called the Alan Turing Building. So that film says all this interest was in these slightly eccentric mathematical geniuses who cracked the code. But if you actually ask yourself what would have had to happen, you crack the code, that's fine, but those messages are coming in so fast you need to be able to do it very quickly, so you design a protocomputer, but then you've got to have some engineers who can build the protocomputer. By and large, engineers at that time were not academically trained. They tended to have learned on the job, left school when they were 16, and so on. So the best engineer in Bletchley Park, a man called Thomas Flowers, left school when he was 16, but he built the machines. If you don't build the machines, then cracking the code doesn't help. Because these messages, they were sort of embarrassing because they were in German, actually. What a surprise. They come out of the German army or the German navy, so you need people to translate them. So there's separate stages. When you translate them, you've got to understand them, you've got to fit them together, which means, and interesting there, it seems that the people who were best at this were people with classical training who knew how the Roman army worked, and they figured out how the German army worked by using that intelligence and put it together to tell to make the messages useful in order to decide what to do. So actually, there weren't just 5 mathematical geniuses. At the height of the Second World War, the height of the conflict, there was something like 9,000 people producing the information that arguably shortened the war. So what this is a wonderful example of interdisciplinarity, but a crucial part of that interdisciplinarity is the language skills. Without the language skills, none of this holds together. And that's what we were trying to argue in that article. This is the story from my side of the Atlantic. There's a similar story from the other side of the Atlantic. There's this thing called Purple. This is the Purple machine, which was the Japanese diplomatic code machine in the years running up to the Second World War. And the person who was involved there, a man called William Friedman, who worked in US Army Signals Intelligence up until 1947. And interestingly, he had to recruit all the staff that populated the American Signals Intelligence Service. What did he do? He was born in Russia and come to America very early in his life. He said, I need mathematicians and I need linguists, because I can't do it without both of them. And so he set out to do that. His team then broke the Japanese code, Purple, in the same way that Turing's team broke the German code, Enigma. And in consequence, the American government, in principle, knew about the Japanese diplomatic secrets before Pearl Harbor. There's then a big debate, which I'm not going to go into, and I have no views on and no expertise on. But historians argue about what happened to that knowledge in the years before 1941. But the point is that the story is the same. It's a story of clever mathematical analysis to understand something, followed by clever linguistic interpretation to be able to make that information useful. So that's another example of language in relation to security. This is a bit, given the time I might skip this, but this is a good piece of news. The British Army has recently changed its policy and is now making language skills an essential part of promotional criteria and looking to try and train people in languages. It's interesting to ask. If you're thinking about the British Army and you think, well, we want to develop a language policy for British soldiers at all levels, from just privates right the way up through to colonels and whatever, but we can't do every language in the world, which 2 languages would we pick? Any suggestions as to, if you were now running the British Army and you had to say, which 2 languages did they end up deciding to concentrate on?
English.
No, English is, we sort of, most people in the British Army speak English. We sort of have that one for free.
French.
French is one, but why French? For Africa, right. It's not French because of those people on the other side of the channel who sell us cheese. It's because of Africa and all the trouble that exists in the northern part of Africa, Mali, Chad, all those areas which are traditionally Francophone Africa. So that's one. Okay, so we're nearly there. Second one? Arabic, yeah, right. Okay. Not Chinese, because the British Army has no intention of going anywhere near China, so it's not a problem. But so different languages in relation to different issues that arise. So focus on these so-called strategic languages, and that's just a map that shows you the black bits are places where there isn't any British military presence. Other bits are places, so there is East Africa, but East Africa was by and large Anglophone anyway for historical imperial reasons. But West Africa and Africa above the Sahara isn't so. Okay, so I won't go into a lot of detail, but that's a kind of a good piece of news that in the military context, the languages are beginning to come back and be treated seriously. Skip over those, but I can come back to those if people want to ask questions. This is an interesting concept. This is the concept of soft power. I don't know if that's a general concept that people know about, but it's a concept developed by the Harvard philosopher, social scientist Joseph Nye, and soft power is the way to get other people to co-opt them to help you rather than to coerce them to help you. So it's the opposite of the kind of hard military power that we've been talking about. And in the report that I mentioned there, The Art of Attraction, the authors of that say that if the UK wishes to exert international influence, one of the key priorities must be the cultivation of foreign language competence. And I would guess that's exactly the same on this side of the Atlantic as well. Here's a case in point, and it's the shootings in Paris, the Charlie Hebdo shootings back in January. We know what happened. 2 gunmen shot 12 members of a satirical magazine, which described itself as secular, atheist, left-wing, and anti-racist. Got worldwide press coverage, and then there was a campaign, Je suis Charlie, from political leaders all across the world and across the political spectrum. What's interesting in this is that by accident I came across an article by an American scholar, Rosemary Salomone, with exactly the same title as the title I'd given for this lecture back in October. And the point she was making in this article, she's a professor of law at St. John's University, and she's the author of a book called True American about language and the education of immigrant children, was that since she could read fluently, she's bilingual I think in English and French, she could read all the French reporting and then compare it with the way it was reported in the English media. And what of course she understood from that is that the set of national assumptions of a country like France are very different from a set of national assumptions like the United States, particularly in regard to issues like free speech. And there are certain things that wouldn't be considered unacceptable in the United States, but that are considered unacceptable in France. At the same time, France is a very secular country in terms of its administration. The United States is a secular country, but as one of my colleagues said to me, I can imagine that the United States, this is an American colleague, I can imagine that the United States could have a woman president. The United States has had a black president. I can't imagine that the United States would have a publicly declared atheist president. Okay? Whereas no British or a French politician would ever do anything like talk about God on the electoral stand. That would be, people would say, what's going on? And what she argues in this article, which is online, it's easy to see, is that there's a completely different perspective on reporting an event that everybody agrees is an atrocious event, but it's reported differently because the cultural assumptions behind the reportage are different, and you have to know the language to understand that. And this is what she says, that when I had to explain that to my family, I realized that because I knew French, I could understand things that other people couldn't. And she concludes, again, if policymakers and educators continue to give mere lip service to foreign language deficit while English sweeps the bill, they disserve the interests of their own country. As I said, my wife is Danish, and sadly, not very long after that, there were shootings in Copenhagen. Again, 2 shootings, this time by a single gunman, one at a meeting about free speech, and one at a synagogue, so one targeting a Swedish cartoonist who had misdrawn depictions of Islam, anti-Islamic cartoons that people didn't like. Interestingly, this one, there wasn't a lot of outcry, oh, well, if you read the Danish newspapers, but that's partly because of the issue of countries like Denmark, where a lot of the media is in English, and so then what happens is that the Danish Prime Minister and the Danish Queen were able to be interviewed in English, and this is the bit that I hope will work. This is the thing we've tried. This was the thing where we wanted to get the sound clip up.
This should work.
Oh
Just
yeah,
do
there
it
it
here,
is.
and then we'll go back to
Your cat just likes to get in on
the.
the act.
He just, yes.
Yeah. But then it goes away.
I think you have to.
If you move the
play it.
cursor down, it should reappear.
No.
Just go back to the other
There.
view.
Yeah, go back to the view.
So
Play it all the way.
Now,
There
now,
it is.
yeah.
Obviously, what happened on Saturday was a big shock for everybody.
that's the Danish Queen.
It certainly left a mark on people everywhere in Denmark. I suppose that realistically looking at it, what happened in Paris in January, well, the events in January in Paris made us think, will we be the next? And we were. So many people, I think, everybody was shocked, but not so very many were surprised, because, well, it's the way the world seems to be these days. And you have to face the fact that there are people who are prepared to do things that you would never have imagined a few years ago, but that's the way things are.
Okay, so that's a nice quote. A, because of the relaxed nature and way that if you've ever seen the English Queen, she would never be interviewed like that. It just wouldn't happen. This strange person here is her husband, who is French, and is generally known to not have integrated very well in Denmark because he speaks French all the time and not Danish, and that's not a great thing to do. But interestingly, and people never report this in the press, he's actually fluent in Japanese and Vietnamese because he comes from a French colonial family. So the way in which the two sort of terrorist events were taken up is very different in the two different countries because of the kind of structure of the political situation and the cultural and linguistic situation. So although both involve shootings against cartoonists for understandable reasons, both of these are in capital cities with significant immigrant populations. The immigration of Copenhagen is much more recent, and therefore the structure of the city is different. Denmark has this very strong tradition of free speech, which is actually much more like the American tradition than the French one. And Danish is getting to be a functionally bilingual country. Almost everybody who wants to have a professional career of any kind in Denmark will speak English. And interestingly, if you look at the Danish education system, English isn't considered a foreign language. In the Danish education system, there are 3 subjects you have to do from the beginning. Danish, not unreasonably, mathematics, and English. Foreign languages are things like German, Chinese, Japanese, or whatever. So what that's doing, if one thinks about it in the world context, it's only a small country, 5 million people, but it's creating a set of people who can then go on to the international job market, completely fluent in English, read and write reports and conduct business negotiations, but who also tend to speak German and French, and often some Spanish or Italian, and increasingly Chinese and Japanese as well. Here's another problem that goes to the next issue that I mentioned at the beginning. I've called this the Peterborough problem. This is from a report in the English populist newspaper, the Daily Mail, a couple of years ago. A primary school with more than 400 pupils has become the first in the country where no children speak English as their mother tongue. They speak Punjabi, Urdu, Portuguese, Czech, Polish, and several African dialects. That's itself very interesting. Suddenly the African ones become dialects. But see, the right thing to say about this school is this is the first school in England where every child is bilingual. Because of course they'll all be native speakers of English. By the time they've been through the educational system, they'll be able to write and read and correspond and interact and so on and so forth. And that's the national resource that I was talking about at the beginning, the indigenous communities. This is an interesting place because it's a point where you get a convergence of the post-war immigration from the former imperial places like India and Pakistan, hence the Punjabi and Urdu, and then a lot of recent immigration with the opening up of the European borders to include countries like the Czech Republic and Poland and so on. And what the teachers have done, this is actually a brilliant school, in the context of all that, they've got themselves up to being the highest rate, almost the highest rating that you can get in the national kind of evaluation of education by being very resourceful in terms of using the language. So what you've got is a town of just under 200,000 people, right in the centre of England, and a bunch of different communities. Here's with approximately 100 languages spoken. Here's another project that I just want to say something about because it's run by a colleague of mine in University of Manchester, called Multilingual Manchester, and if you want more details you can Google for Multilingual Manchester. This is a big city with a population of nearly 3 million, largest city in the north of England. We call it the capital of the north of England, other people argue for that one. Lots of different communities, lots of linguistic diversity, and then this project directed by my colleague Joran Matras. And you can see the link there. That's the front page from his website. What have you got in Manchester? 200 languages. Nearly half the city is bi or multilingual. Significant number say English isn't their main language. But those are the principal languages that are spoken in the city. So again, that city has a huge kind of resource, and New York would be another example of a similar kind of issue. And what's behind the project is to try and make people aware of their community heritage, make people aware that they have a skill, and then find ways to translate that skill into a national asset. And that's the big challenge that we have, and that large cities around the world have. And these are some of the things that are being done there. I can take questions about that if people are interested. As I said, I didn't want to finish without saying something about language and culture, because what I've done so far is to essentially give you instrumentalist reasons why it would be a good thing to know languages and not limit yourself to English. But we should remember that just knowing a language is an intrinsically valuable thing in terms of stretching your intellectual horizons, opening your new eyes to new cultural experiences, and generally enhancing your understanding of the world. There's then the issue of which ones you should learn. Well, in a sense, it doesn't really matter, but it is a problem for Anglophones because we've started with English, which is the one that most other people try and learn first. But any language helps to lay good new intellectual foundations. If you want to refine it, then you can try and break languages down into groups. I've just made a little sort of attempt here, and you can say, well, Here are some categories, so you might say, well, there are the major world languages, Spanish, Mandarin, and Arabic. There are languages of particular regions, Turkish, Indonesian. There are the heritage languages within the communities that I've just been talking about. And even the learning of ancient languages can be a valuable skill in that sense of enhancing one's intellectual capacities. Those are the top languages that were asked for in our business study. Interesting, I'm talking to somebody about the internet, and they said, well, you don't need language on the internet because it's all in English. I said, yeah, that's because when you Google, if you Google in English, you only get English. Actually, it's not a fact about the internet, that's a fact about you. Most of the internet is not in English, and then the question arises, well, that's all right, because we've got Google Translate, so we don't need to worry. If you ask which languages are most frequent on the internet, English is most frequent, but then there's Chinese, Spanish, Japanese, etc. And you can do rankings of the languages of the world. So this table gives you languages of the world in terms of the number of native speakers, and you get one order. In terms of internet users, you get another order, and websites, you get a different order. And so some languages like Korean come in here because almost everybody in Korea is an internet user, because the technology is differently deployed in countries like Korea and Japan. So even numerically, the number of the population of Korea or Japan is quite small compared to the population of, say, India or China or the United States. But in terms of the percentage of people who deploy those mechanisms, it's much, much higher. And so the need for languages changes in that context as well. But again, it's not just English. If we ask what kind of language, well, you've got to be able to read and write. You've also got to be able to speak and listen, and that relates to this distinction between what we call hard power and soft power, because soft power essentially is about talking to people and listening to people. And Google Translate isn't so good at that, although there are now little apps you can put on your phone. They're pretty, more or less about, what are you called, and not anything more subtle than that. So just some conclusions. Knowledge of languages is essential for those who wish to operate in the new global community. Languages are important for business, diplomacy, security, in peace and in war. So basically always. And Anglophone countries need to avoid the complacency that I talked about at the beginning. We also must recognize and value our homegrown multilingual talent, of which there is a great deal, both in this country and in the United Kingdom. In short, English is not enough.
Can you go back?